I'm delighted to be here, and nice to see quite a lot of old friends. The only depressing thing is that the more of these things I go to, the more people I meet will say, I remember meeting you in 1970. That is a bit depressing at times. But I'm going to be talking about the national grid and its visual impact. If I can find the right button. It's visual impact provision. But I wanted to begin by talking about curlews. I grew up in Sheffield in a family of passionate ramblers with the mass trespass ringing in their ears. And the soundtrack of my childhood was curlews. Walking in the Peak District was very much what we did and they had always done. That's where my mum and dad met, going out to Edale on trains at weekends. And so I have a passion for the wild places, despite the fact that I've lived and worked all my life in the conurbations of the West Midlands and South Yorkshire and so on. And I'm very lucky, I think, that I've spent a lot of time in a lot of the wild places that you are very involved with. And I think also, if you're old enough, you would remember, and probably nobody is here, that a lot of my generation had their real introduction to the idea of conservation through Peter Scott and the Look programmes, black and white on a tiny little television screen. And the soundtrack for that was the curlew as well, that fantastically evocative sound. Well, sadly, the curlew is almost a disappeared species. It's now got to the stage where if you hear one, you stop and you listen, whereas actually you could walk for hours and never be out of earshot of curlews when I was a child. And part of the reason is the conflict between wildlife and the other things that we do with landscapes. And as luck or bad luck would have it, curlews' preferred nesting sites are almost exactly the places that the geoengineers identify as the best places to put wind farms. Those windswept tops of heather moorland are precisely the place where you get the best bang for your bucks for a wind generator, and also where you really would want to build your nest if you were a curlew. So there's a conflict. There's always been a conflict between the different uses that we have for our wild places, and there will continue to be. But the curlew has struggled in lots of other ways. It's one of those species that's really suffered as we've seen the disintegration of the rural landscape, and that's been the hallmark of my lifetime, certainly. We've seen what was a reasonably integrated landscape become more and more disintegrated. And so just a simple shift like the move towards plastic-wrapped silage and the ability to zero graze wiped out huge areas of landscape where wildflower meadows for centuries have been the places where you would hear curlews in the summer. And on the coast we've seen a similar kind of pressures. So the salt marsh that would have been the wintering habitat of those curlews, again shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, with sea defences, with built development, with rising sea levels and so on and so forth. So part of the legacy that we've all inherited is a 60 or 70 year period of attrition and loss. But what we've learned, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years is that actually we have to have a scale of thinking that matches that scale of destruction. We have to begin to think in a much more integrated and joined up way about the way in which we conserve and protect landscapes and everything that they stand for. And it's no surprise really that the Wildlife Trusts have their Living Landscapes programme, and the RSPB has its Futurescapes programme. Heritage Lottery Fund's Living Landscapes and Heritage Landscapes programmes are a really significant part of the way in which funding is now being distributed to people like you. So I think we've learned that reintegration is the challenge, re-engagement with a whole broad range of stakeholders who can collectively help to weave the landscape back together. And we do actually have some very good examples. We are beginning to see some joined up thinking again. This is, some of you would have seen this slide before, but this always amuses me. This is Shrewsbury on a pretty bad afternoon. What's striking about it is that the traffic lights are still on. And we are really brilliant in this country at detailed, focused technology. So it's, no traffic light engineer worth his or her salt would dream of designing a scheme that failed because it had 2 meters of rainwater on the top. But we seem incapable of recognising that traffic congestion at this junction is probably not going to be too bad today, and we could switch the lights off. And the joining up is a real challenge for most people most of the time. Our education system is very tunnel visioned. Most of our careers are career ladders rather than career webs. So the joining up, the making connections is difficult. But in the case of water, for instance, I think there are lots of us very strongly advocating the need to look upstream, to begin to think about where that floodwater is coming from. And it's in your landscapes that there are ways in which we can make the landscape reabsorbent, we can rebuild the peat bogs, we can actually re-wet those upland catchments that can actually reduce the risk of flooding downstream, secure the drinking water through the dry summers and so on. So we kind of know that you have a key role to play in delivering a more joined up kind of programme. On the coast, similarly, I'm president of the Essex Wildlife Trust. We are just one of the areas where there is a brilliant example of using flood defences, sea defences in a different kind of way, and in the process restoring salt marsh on a pretty grand and pretty amazing scale. And there are ways in which I think we can take that much further. If you look into the creeks that have re-emerged on what was agricultural land on the Essex coast as the sea defences have been punctured, they're absolutely teeming with fish fry, millions and millions of fish fry, Dover sole and sea bass and a whole range of other species. There is a key there to the way in which we could link with other parts of the economy. Nobody, I think, saw the reduction in artificial sea defences as a way of beginning to build the fisheries, but clearly there are those kind of connections to be made. And one of the things I'm very involved with in the South East is trying to make what you might call a silver triangle between the salt marshes on the coast of Essex and Kent and the tidal estuary. And I'm working on that, and I'll talk a bit about that in the workshop later on today. But also the potential for offshore wind farms to be the sanctuary areas, to build those structures with artificial reefs at the base, make them no-take fishery areas, so that actually you can begin to see how, if you're going to have that much intrusion and that much investment, we should at the very least be maximising the environmental benefits, not just looking at them as energy generators, but for God's sake, we should be able to make those the places that the fish can recover. Instead of which the government's decided recently that they should be built slightly further apart so the fishing boats can get between them. So there's a long way still to go, but there are answers out there, and some of you have some of those answers. We're just desperate for somebody to hear them, it seems to me. The VIP, the Stakeholder Advisory Board for this visual impact programme, tells you something about the respect there is for your organisation and many others. And I'm just going to spend the last few minutes talking about the challenges of this programme. Essentially, at first glance you think, God, £500 million, that is an astonishing amount of money to spend in these wild and remote places, until you discover that undergrounding a high-level cable and pylons costs about £20 million a kilometre, and then you start to realise it's not that much money. But essentially, this is money which the regulator has decided, Ofgem has decided that the industry should put back into the landscapes that have pylons and power lines running across them. And a lot of you will have been working on those programmes with power distributors for quite a long time. There's some very good work gone on in quite a lot of the AONBs. This is the very big pylons. This is the national grid, and it only applies to the existing network. So the new ones that are planned to link up Wilver across Anglesey and those kinds of situations are not part of what we're addressing. But we have the challenge of deciding how best to spend £500 million in national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty over the next 4 years now. One of the questions is, can we regard this as the first 500 million of several? And so part of what we need to do is reach conclusions fairly quickly and amicably and creatively, so that we can demonstrate to the regulator really very quickly, because they'll be making the decisions well within that 4 years, that actually this is such good value that the national grid should be asked to provide another £500 million perhaps for the following 5 years. So there is all to play for really here. And I think if you start to think about how challenging the questions are, you just need to, I mean, I'm having a crash course in not only recognising pylons from several miles away and deciding whether it's one of ours or not, which is something to entertain the family at Christmas parties, you can imagine, but also just to realise how difficult it is actually when you start to get down to the detail of it. Undergrounding would seem to be everybody's top of the list. How can we make these things disappear? Well, we'll stick the cables in the ground. Undergrounding involves, at the moment anyway, a 50-metre wide trench through the landscape, a haul road, which I now discover is something which the farmers rather like hanging on to afterwards. You know, here is somebody who's provided a road through their farm, which no doubt they objected to at the beginning, but now rather like. So there are challenges just in the scale of disruption, if you like, not to mention the traffic related with all of that. And these are in some of our wildest and remote landscapes. So that in itself is a challenge. And some of you who've been dealing with this technology for a while will know that actually there is also the problem of what you do at the end of your undergrounding. At the end of the undergrounding, where the cables come back up out of the ground and have to reconnect onto pylons, is just about the biggest, ugliest structure you could imagine, the kind of switching collection of wires and fences and cables and things. And so deciding how far, how long the undergrounding should be has a lot to do with how you can deal with the ends of that process. So we have a whole, two big teams of landscape architects currently who will probably have visited you if you have National Grid cables in your particular landscape. Land use consultants and Gillespies are out there analysing every one of the National Grid power lines that runs through a national park or an AINV at the moment. They feed back in October to the stakeholder panel. At that point we then begin to start to make hard judgments. So we have to bear in mind the scale of the disruption. We also, I think, have to recognise that there are many landscapes where actually the solution will be worse than the problem, really. There may be landscapes like this where actually you could underground and in the process have the resources to rebuild lost walls and to re-establish a landscape pattern. But the disruption of the 4 or 5 years of the process is pretty scary stuff. There are other landscapes where actually the last thing that the landowners would want is to dig a 50-metre wide trench through their patch. Fruit orchards that have taken 50 years to develop are not the place. I mean, the fruit farmer would be far happier keeping the pylons than having cabling undergrounded through that landscape. There are other obvious examples too, historic landscapes where the archaeological value of the site means that you simply can't start digging underground. As a trustee of the Heritage Lottery Fund for 6 years, I was very involved with the debates about Stonehenge. And at one point, the engineers just wanted a cut and cover tunnel through that landscape, a bloody great trench with a lid on it, until they realised that Stonehenge was only one of very, very many world-class significant archaeological sites in that landscape, and that you couldn't do that. So I think there are complexities to this decision-making process without question, and hopefully we're going to be working with you to achieve the best results. One of the other questions we have to ask is, do we, in this first tranche, if it is a first tranche, do we try and find 4 or 5 different kinds of landscapes so that we can appeal to a wide range of tastes and passions, and so we can test and develop different new techniques. This is in the Peak District, Langdondale, clearly a landscape spoiled by its pylons, but also a landscape that has a heaving great road running down the side of it, so even when you've removed the pylons, you'll still have noise pollution on a pretty grand scale in that landscape. But clearly a difficult landscape to actually start to put the cables anywhere other than on high pylons. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's a very challenging landscape. How does that compare with the South Downs, for instance? And a much softer landscape of chalk and deep alluvial soils, much easier to dig in, but much more open, so more difficult to hide the process. What about the Lake District and these iconic landscapes? Are they more important because they are in the public consciousness much more? Should we be going for iconic landscapes as a place to make the statement? I spend a lot of my time at Snowdonia. Is that a landscape that should just not have pylons anywhere in it? Ironically, the earlier of the national parks have relatively few of these pylons because the power lines were steered around them. The most recent ones, New Forest and the South Downs, are covered in them because actually nobody was really bothering very hard about this problem in the days before they were designated. So really what I'm saying is there are a lot of considerations here. You have a panel, I hope, of representative stakeholders, including yourselves. We will be meeting a few times a year, advised by expert consultants from the landscape professions. They are being steered by Caris Swanwick, who some of you will know, ex-professor at Sheffield University. There's a lot of money, there's a genuine enthusiasm from National Grid to see how best to make this work. And I think there is all to play for, but we have to do it creatively and quickly. And finally, I would say that actually, for me, the most interesting thing about this is that it sets a precedent for other regulators. Here we have £500 million being determined by Ofgem for landscapes related to the customers who use electricity. That's a great leap for what is essentially a regulator full of bean counters. Regulators, the great, well, with no respect really, know nothing about these things. What about Ofwat? I mean, for God's sake, if there was ever a more graphic connection to be made between water customers and your landscapes, it is the water industry. And being able to wave Ofgem in the air and say, well, look, they can do it, I think for me may very well be the most significant legacy of this next 5 years. But it's down to you to work with us to make sure that we get it as right as we can and that we move on into the next tranche with added enthusiasm. So thank you very much.